Bloody taxes.
James, it's January. We're halfway through the financial year. Why are you doing taxes?
Look, I may have been a little late getting my tax returns in this year.
Even after we spoke about it at the beginning of episode 7?
Yes, and I'm very ashamed, blah, blah, blah. Can you just help me?
Of course, man. What are you having trouble with?
Look, I can't work out what tax bracket I'm in. I've added up all of my salary, interest on all my bank accounts, everything. But I can't figure out if I'm making above or below... I'm writing it down on this piece of paper. I know it's pretty big, but I don't want everyone
It's all right, James. I know I'm the budget boy, but I can control myself, even if it is a really big number. Oh my God, James! You're rich! Hey, Marco, Stensley, Lavernicus, let's shank him and take his wallet! They just come to me, James. Sometimes.
Who is that?
I don't even know. I don't even know what that sounds like. It sounds like something.
I'm now imagining a commander playgroup with Stalinsky and Marco.
Marco, Stensley, Lavernicus, and you.
Yeah, I'm terrified now. They're gonna see my foil chrome mogs and just stab mine.
Beautiful link to the playgroup episode. Somewhere in the world, there is a playgroup with Lavernicus in it.
There definitely is, and we still have a score to settle from last episode. If you forgot that.
Oh my goodness.
We'll settle that at the end of this episode.
End of the episode. All right, done. Sounds good. Good. Well, before that, we do have an incoming transmission, James.
Well, should we say who we are first?
Oh, right. Oh my goodness. We do normally do that, don't we?
I think we were just riffing for too long.
We weren't riffing too long. Welcome to the Get Commanded podcast by the Greensboro Commander community. It's the GCP by the GCC, helping you to have better games of Commander. I'm your host, Walt.
And hello, Commander players. I am your other host, James.
All right, now they know who we are.
Yeah.
We can get to
do you want to see what the Space Commanders have on us this week?
There is an incoming transmission from the deep depths of the galaxy from the Space Commanders. It's time to get commanded.
Stax is a notoriously unpopular archetype in the Commander format, but some cards that resemble Stax pieces continue to see consistent play. Consider your personal Stax threshold and whether it can be made more flexible.
You don't want to talk about Stax?
I feel like if we, are they going to lock the door?
Again?
Green light? I'll tell you what, the green light would have been more thematic of a thing to do for this episode.
True. You know what? I think I can see, it looks a little red today. I feel like there might be...
Blood? Is it blood?
Is it blood? Alright, before we get lost in that imagery... Stax. We should probably define what it is. I think a lot of us know what it is, but it's not something we see all the time in Commander. So
no, it's not. And I think that, as you can tell by my groan, that generally, as the Space Commander said, it's a pretty controversial thing.
It is. I did actually, I found this quote from EDH Rec. They have a really, really good page. It's in the show notes. It'll be linked in there, on Stax as an archetype in Commander, specifically. They have 2 sections here, so I'm just going to read them because they summarize it really well, I think. They've got, the first one here is the description of the archetype, and then they've got a description of Stax cards themselves from EDH Rec. So the first quote here is, this is straight from the Stax theme page on the EDH Rec's website. Stax is a strategy of resource denial that uses permanents with abilities that prevent players from performing actions in the game. For example, preventing them from untapping their permanents. Some Stax cards are symmetrical in that they affect all players instead of all opponents. By designing a deck to avoid using certain game mechanics, the deck is not penalized as much for preventing all players from using those mechanics. That's pretty good. I feel.
Good example. Untapping, preventing people from untapping, but Stax is a very broad range of effects that it can have on a board.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to read this one of Stax cards, and then we'll jump into what we think of these as descriptions. So this is from that same article. This is a description of Stax cards themselves. Stax cards typically include one or more of the following in the rules text to limit or delay a wide variety of opponent actions. May contain the word can't, don't, or instead to subvert an expected game mechanic, like Winter Orb or Static Orb, that kind of thing. May increase the mana cost of other spells, so we have spells like Aura of Silence or Sphere of Resistance. These increase the cost in some way.
Yep.
May interfere with untapping or cause permanents to enter tapped. So Tangle Wire and Stasis are
I've died
examples
to
here.
Stasis before.
Stasis is very mean in that
Yeah.
way. That was that one where
I had a Force of Negation upkeep trigger.
Yes.
And
Pact of Negation.
Pact of Negation upkeep trigger.
So you have to pay 3 blue or you lose the game.
Yeah, but before I could untap, someone had cast a Stasis.
you couldn't untap 5 mana.
I just died.
That's pretty funny. The last little example here is may cause or encourage players to sacrifice one or more permanents. The examples here are Smokestack or Tainted Aether. So I think the main thing to draw a line here with Stax that I think separates it from sort of the closest thing that we see in Commander is like a control deck.
Like counter spells.
Counter spells, lots of removal, this kind of thing. Is similar in that it makes people a bit upset. But the main difference is that that's sort of mostly interacting on the stack and instant speed, whereas the key thing they were describing there is often these Stax revolves around permanence.
And they usually are a worldwide effect. It's not targeting a specific player.
Players can't do this, players don't do this. Yeah, that's basically the main thing. And different from removal as well, which is again like an instant speed or, removing one thing. This is saying, no, all players can't do insert game action here.
Yeah, okay.
So, I thought it'd be interesting actually. Do you know the origin of Stax as an archetype? Do you know...
I know that you mentioned Smokestacks before.
Yeah.
And I know that that's where the word came from.
Well, it's interesting you say that. There's actually 2 theories as to the origin of...
Wait, historians have argued over this for decades.
I mean, if you can call them historians for, 25 years ago. But basically, yeah.
Okay.
So look, you're partly right. Smokestacks is a card that was played in one of the earliest Stax decks that ever existed.
It's pretty brutal. It forces you to sack over and over and over again.
Yeah, it's definitely an example of a Stax piece. Definitely that's a reasonable thing to conclude. But there's actually another theory, and I think this one's given slightly more weight when people are running through it. So I'd like to tell a little story, James.
Oh, wait, hang on. Hot chocolate? Teddy bear?
Get comfy.
I'm cozy.
It won't be long, just a little rundown, but I'd like to take us back to 2002. So 5 is playing on the radio. People can afford to buy a house.
Sorry, that tickled me.
In a playground, Grade 1 Walt is running rampant with an unsleeved fallen angel.
Wow.
This is setting the scene.
That is
okay.
2005. What? 2002.
2002.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
A real throwback. So in Vintage in 2002, which was actually at the time known as Type 1, because back then there were only 2 formats of Magic. There was Standard and there was Vintage.
Which is all of Magic's cards.
Yeah.
And then what
Standard
was in
cards.
rotation.
Yeah, so it was called Type 1 and Type 2. So Vintage at the time was called Type 1. It's now known as Vintage because there's a lot more formats. There was this particular deck that was called Growatog. It basically played a card called Psychotog, which you read today and you're like, this sounds terrible. I'm pretty sure you discard cards to buff it. It's a Dimir card. It's 1 black blue.
Yeah.
You discard cards to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. Right. And there's another card called Quirion Dryad, which was the other sort of win con in this
that's
deck.
been reprinted.
It has been reprinted a lot.
+1 counters when you cast creatures, right?
When you cast a white, black... Every color except what it is. So it's green.
Yeah.
So if you cast a white, black, blue, or red spell, you put a +1 counter on it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's been reprinted.
Yeah. So this is obviously, in the context of modern Vintage, these are terrible cards.
Yeah.
But at the time, this deck was basically unbeatable because it played a bunch of free spells. So this is the reason that Gush, the card, is still banned in Vintage, is because at the time...
And in Pauper. Good card.
Banned in Pauper too. Banned in Pauper later, obviously. Yeah. But there was a few other effects that basically you were getting free spells that were growing these creatures and you would just swing for lethal so quickly and with cards in hand. It was just basically unbeatable. And it's the reason, actually, this specific deck is the reason that Gush got banned in Vintage, was because of this deck. Like, immediately after, whichever that tournament was, immediately after that, it got banned because they were like, well, it's too good.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. Grower-Tog is a busted archetype that everyone has heard of.
We all know Grower-Tog. He lives down the street.
I've got 3 commander decks based around Grower-Tog.
Well, the long and the short of it is that Magic players love a good problem, right? We love a problem, but you know what we love even more than a problem? We love the solution to the problem.
We love figuring out the solution and having that aha!
Exactly. So, what's the deal with these free spells? How do you stop a deck that has free spells? You make them cost more. At the time, Thorn of Amethyst was a card that was legal in Vintage. I think it still is. Basically makes non-creature spells cost 1 more. So Gush...
Still played in lots of formats.
Yeah,
today.
but now your Gush costs 1 mana instead of free. And when you stack that up over several spells, it becomes a real issue. So this deck, though, at the time that contained Thorn of Amethyst, it also contained Smokestacks, was enormously expensive because you had to play a playset of Mishra's Workshop, which is on the reserve list, which means it's never going to be printed again.
Yep.
They're like, at the time, they were a lot cheaper, but it was still like 4 copies of this was setting you back like $1,000. There were several Power 9 cards you had to play in this deck.
So 2002, you had a choice. You could either buy a house or buy this deck.
For the same amount of money, too, for $4,000.
Well, I didn't expect to get so political in this episode, but go
You're
on.
welcome. We've started on a good spot. So, basically, this deck was called the $4,000 solution. And when you stylize
such a cool name.
When you stylize this, you go $ the 4K solution.
4 being the...
Stax.
It's
It's Stax. That's the origin of Stax as a name. Probably. It could be the card Smokestacks, but most likely it's because of the 4K solution.
That's wacky. Yeah, so like the 4 looks like the A.
The 4 looks like an A.
Like you would on a number plate.
Yeah, exactly right.
I would love to see a Commander player that loves Stax get a personalized number plate.
That's
of the $4,000 solution.
$T4KS, yeah.
That's... I never knew that.
Right?
That's such a cool story.
I was doing some digging and I was like, how did people not know about this? Like, what a fantastic origin. Like, normally, you know, the origin of the name of a deck just comes from a card.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like, we call it Storm because there's a deck that's called Storm.
Or, like, even mechanics have, like, become things that have come from cards.
Yeah, I have a Cascade deck because it has the mechanic Cascade on it. But yeah, this has, like, a legitimate historical story based on 2002.
That's so cool. Because it's,
Type 1 vintage.
Yes, it did contain Smokestacks. Maybe someone who named the deck, and put it into the... Well, they wouldn't have put it online because everyone... No, they would have put it on a piece of paper and put it up in their local game store as a deck list.
In the newsletter.
Yeah, in the newsletter that gets mailed to your house physically by a postman.
Sheldon Menery drops it off at your doorstep.
Maybe they were just trying to be clever of combining Smokestacks and the $4,000.
Maybe.
That's weird. I never knew that.
There you go, right?
That's wild.
Yeah, so that's the origin of Stax. So we can trace these cards that are now known as Stax pieces back to that deck, which contained a lot of them. So Smokestacks was at that time. That was the one that made you sacrifice permanents. We can point to Thorn of Amethyst, which makes your spells cost more. These are like still types of cards we see in Stax, right?
That was the first ever time it happened. I'd love to see a Ristic Studies video on that.
Yeah, I feel like it's only a matter of time, right? Surely. Now, before we get right into a discussion of actually what we think of Stax and how we would want to play it, and
I've expressed my opinion in a noise.
That's all James has to say about it. I do want to have a quick disclaimer here about specifically CDH, the most competitive part of our format. I think you can probably disregard pretty much everything we say from here onwards because we're going to most likely advise you to play, less stacks or be careful about playing stacks because it makes people upset. You don't have to worry about that in CDH. Because,
well, you have a stacks deck for CDH.
Yeah,
that's your deck.
People actually plan for it. Like, you expect to see a stacks deck in your pod when you play CDH because, especially when people are using fast mana, they're using treasures, they're using rituals, they're casting many, many spells in a single turn.
And instant speed win cons are like the way most decks win.
Yeah.
Stax decks stop that from happening.
Yeah, so they're actually better in CDH pods than they are in most casual pods.
Settle down. I thought you were about to say Stax decks are just better than any other CDH deck. Wow.
I wouldn't dream of it.
Big claims.
At least not while you're here.
Speaking of CDH,
Yes.
I am, at the time of this recording, tomorrow, I'm about to compete in the Australian CDH tournament.
This is the
from the Discord.
the Dockside debacle.
The Dockside
right?
debacle. And huge shout out to Migs and a bunch of the other people that have been developing this from the Australian CDH server. I want to put it on record before I go that I'm really nervous and really excited. So I'll see you there tomorrow, guys.
Yeah.
I know a lot of you guys listen, so I'm looking forward to it.
And thanks so much for getting in touch with us. They actually messaged us on Twitter. So
super cool.
If you have anything interesting that you'd like us to see, definitely follow us on Twitter at GetCommanded and
invite us to like your local game store.
Yeah,
and,
or like webcam games, anything that you want us to get involved in. We're very active. We're not like, massive internet celebrities. We will reply if you add us, like, please.
Probably become pals. Like at this early stage, get in now.
Exactly
before
right.
we blow up and get huge.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Well, if we're moving away from CDH, I think we've sort of alluded to this already, but how do you feel like that general attitude is towards stacks in casual Commander, from what you've seen?
Well, I think, I made a joke at the start of this episode after the transmission where I just groaned, because that is the joke response that all Commander players will take when they hear, oh, I'm playing stacks. And basically it's because stacks immediately evokes this image of, I'm going to play Magic and you're not.
Yeah.
Like, it's that kind of thing. And especially when we're talking about casual, we're doing it for fun. Like, we're the only reason we're playing Commander is because we want to have a fun time.
Yeah.
And if I'm actually not untapping any of my permanents, I'm not going to be able to do anything.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to have a fun time. So that's, I think, the immediate image that's postulated in my mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally accurate. I think in general, when players are told, here's your deck, here's the things your deck does, and then someone else's deck says, hey, your deck actually doesn't do that anymore, it feels pretty bad, right? Like, your gut instinct is probably totally reasonable in saying, like, oh, I sort of wanted to do the thing my deck does, and I'm sort of being told I can't do that. So that's totally reasonable. I do think, I want to bring up, we mentioned it in our Playgroups episode, the distinction that the rules committee make between games of Commander, between untrusted and trusted games of Commander.
Yeah.
So this is like the difference between trusted being like your playgroup who you play with every week, people you play with at the kitchen table. If you go to the game store and play with the same 3 people, that's your trusted game. That's your playgroup. Whereas an untrusted game would be like, arriving at a random LGS or like playing in a Discord you've never played in before, and webcam games, that kind of thing.
This is actually super crucial definition that the rules committee make. I actually just recently read a bunch of articles by Sheldon talking about how the rules committee go about bans and what, influences them. And they put a lot of emphasis on that the bans are meant to be kind of an example. And the trusted groups are meant to make their own decisions about what they can and can't play.
Yeah.
The rules committee is there to make a guideline for these trusted play groups. So we know that Commander is a social format. So therefore it's kind of implied that you have a social group to play Commander with. Yeah. Or just a regular play group. So yeah, I think this is a good distinction to make.
I think as well, specifically in terms of playing stacks, and especially if you want to play stacks, a trusted playgroup is just going to inherently be a better place to do that.
Yeah.
People are going to be more familiar with the way that you build decks. They're going to be more familiar with what you mean when you say, this is stacks, this is tuned, those words that you might like to use. A trusted playgroup is going to understand what you mean by that a lot easier. Sitting down in a random pod at a game store or, during webcam games, even at a convention, it's much harder to condense all of that information down when you don't know people already.
Yeah.
You're sort of already trying to get all the stuff like, oh, this is my name and, these are my pronouns and all that stuff you should be doing anyway. And then you're like, oh, and this is the deck and this is what I want to do. And, things are going to get lost in translation there.
For sure. And I think the only thing that I would kind of urge our audience to be careful of in this instance is yes, a normal playgroup, a regular playgroup, and a playgroup that is open and having this fun, yes, we welcome anything. You got to be careful that if you welcome something in, that you then don't go, okay, now I need to change all my decks to have counter magic for this.
Yeah.
Because then you create what we've referred to a lot when we talk to each other about, like an arms race, like this idea of like, oh my god, Walt's just bought a bigger gun than me. I need to go and buy a bazooka.
Yeah.
Like, you end up in I need more specific weaponry to deal with what Walt's doing. I actually remember way back in the day, you used to run this dumb little creature in your Selesnya deck.
Oh.
When I was playing Niv Mizzet.
Yeah, Dryad Militant. I think we mentioned this in the last episode as
Yeah.
well. So it's like a Selesnya hybrid mana. It's a 2/1 that says if an instant or sorcery would be put into a graveyard, instead exile it. And yeah, like it was such a silver bullet card for specifically your deck. But in terms of what my deck is trying to do, it's actually like not doing anything. The deck I was playing it in was a token deck. Like this is doing absolutely nothing for my deck. I'm not saying you should never play cards that affect your opponent's board.
We actually got a comment in our Discord that says Dryad Militant is a good card.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah. Some people, different strokes, different folks. But like, I think in general, we try to err you more towards board wipes and removal as your main ways of dealing with other players, and try to be away from these silver bullet cards, especially when they are specifically for that deck. Like, when I play James, I need this card. It's just going to result in this arms race where everyone's trying to find the better silver bullet card, and it's not going to be fun for anybody.
For sure. And I think that, when you are approaching, that's our warning to trusted pods. When you're approaching untrusted pods, really highlight that you are going to play Stax if you are going to.
Yeah.
And if you're not sure whether your deck is Stax or not, stick around. We're gonna highlight some things.
Absolutely,
but
we are.
I think that untrusted pods are much more likely to get upset or angered, or even like they might never want to play with you again if you don't tell them that you're about to play Thorn of Amethyst.
Yeah, well, this is kind of the origin of the term pub stomper that we hear sometimes around LGSs and stuff, which is someone who, well, the image is someone who cruises into a game store, intentionally pulls out the strongest deck they have and says, it's a 7, it doesn't do anything, it's super slow, it's battle cruisery, and then they stomp you or whatever. We obviously, it's a stereotype, it's very rarely the case, but we want to avoid that type of game that can actually happen, where someone feels like, I sat down expecting this kind of thing, and what I got was something completely different. And that's why we emphasize the Rule Zero conversation so much, is we want to have really good games of Commander. And
that's the point of this podcast.
Yeah, I think Stax is definitely something you want to bring up then. Well, look, we've had a good chat about Stax, like, in the format, how people feel about it. We haven't talked that much about it specifically, like the cards,
like the
actual Stax pieces.
We've mentioned Smokestacks and Thorn of Amethyst because that was like the OG, but that was way back when there was only 2 formats of Magic.
Yeah,
it's been a couple of years since 2002. 2002, I'd only just arrived in Australia. So
wow, that puts it in perspective. Yeah. There's a lot more cards that do it, and again, we're talking about permanents that say, players can't do this, players can't do that. So I want to play a little game, actually, James.
Oh, sweet! Can we put some like game show music on?
Sure. If Walt can find some royalty-free game show music, there'll be game show music playing right now.
If not, is
it Stax? Let's find out with Walter.
We'll be right back after a word from our messengers.
Yeah. Sponsors. Someday, maybe. Is it Stax show? Brought to you by me. Let's start right off, actually, with a card that kind of, I think maybe the Space Commanders might have been inspired by this in sending us this command. It was spoiled recently. It's probably coming out soon by the time you all hear about this episode. Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. This is the new Elish Norn that's coming out in the set Phyrexia All Is One, All Will Be One.
All Will Be One.
All Will Be One.
Much more menacing. And did you say they were inspired by or terrified by? I don't think the Space Commanders will be able to attack Elish Norn in her final form.
No, that's true. I wonder what power and toughness the Space Commanders have.
Like 13-13? Not quite Emrakul, but like 13-13.
Ludovic's test subject? Yeah. 13-13 seems
13,
appropriate.
13.
Yeah, I like that.
Each of them are 13-13.
Collectively 48. Yeah. What do you reckon? Is it Stax? So for those who don't know, it's a one of the new Praetors. It's 4 and a white, so can only be played in decks that contain the color white in Commander. Can be your commander because it's legendary. It's legendary creature Praetor. It might be Phyrexian Praetor. It's a 4/7 with vigilance. It says if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it triggers twice instead.
Sweet, Panharmonicon with less restrictions.
And it says, if a permanent entering the battlefield under opponent's control would cause a triggered ability of a permanent they control to trigger, it doesn't.
So, like 15 other cards mashed into one and on top of Panharmonicon with less restrictions.
Yeah.
Oh, this card's busted.
It's really, really good. There was a good bit of discourse, I should say, on Twitter because Sheldon Menery, as soon as it got spoiled, who is a member of the Rules Committee.
And the grandfather of Commander.
Yes, absolutely. Like the origins of Commander, he's involved in them, definitely.
I said Godfather. Sorry.
Godfather.
I didn't mean to offend Sheldon. Sorry.
No, I'm sure you'll understand. He posted he posts on Star City Games, their website, and he posted an article where he basically said it got blown a bit out of proportion, but he said this card resembles a lot of the things we look at when we think about banning a card. So he outlined some of the ways in which it does that.
Yeah.
So it's preventing your opponents from doing something that's probably really important to their deck. It's wildly good in your deck and should be played in basically any deck that has an ETB theme in it.
If it's white and has ETBs, put it in.
Yeah. Like he outlined a bunch of his reasoning, but
I've read the article. It's a really good outline, and
I think so.
I've recently after delving into CDH and hearing conversations about Dockside and Drannith Magistrate and all these cards, it does resemble something that should be banned. And in answer to the game show question, it is Stax. It is stopping your opponents doing something.
And it's on a permanent as well?
Yeah, 100%. And we literally just watched the most recent, for us, Game Nights episode with the monocolored Phyrexian decks with Jimmy, Josh, Ashley, and Lady
Danger. Yeah.
Awesome game. But this card really did the game.
Yeah.
I'm not going to spoil what happens, but the first effect of doubling things just accelerated Josh, the pilot, way ahead of everybody and was just able to do some really insane things.
Definitely.
The second effect, I was like, I don't think it's actually going to be relevant in this deck. Looking at all the commanders, I don't see it going to be a relevant thing. So maybe it won't be that Staxy. It was relevant in some very crucial situations in the game.
Several times.
And to multiple different opponents. It wasn't like, Jimmy was doing something with ETBs. It was like everyone's deck contained an ETB.
Yeah.
And everyone got affected by it.
I think the thing I realized watching the game, and we turned to each other afterwards and we were kind of like, we sort of see what Sheldon's talking about.
Yeah,
now.
for sure.
We had a conversation about that. But what the thing I realized is that what Sheldon was alluding to is like, you may not realize it, but almost every deck you play contains some Enter the Battlefield effects on them.
Yeah.
Like, you don't realize it says permanent. It could be a land. It could be an artifact, creature, enchantment. Anything entering the battlefield is just not going to happen.
Well, something that we had a conversation about just like an hour ago was the fact that Vorinclex's rules texts basically reads very similar to Elish Norn. Like, it does a thing with +1 counters and doubles it for you and makes it worse for your opponents. However, some decks, even decks with +1 counters as their main focus, can kind of do stuff without +1 counters going on.
Yeah, I've got a Golem tribal deck, and like, if I can't put +1 counters on them, I can just make more Golems. Like that, I can totally shift my strategy towards that instead.
Exactly. Instead of building up, you go wide, or maybe you look for different things. And also, like, Vorinclex, it is accelerating super quickly, sure, but it's like, the putting +1 counters on things, I don't think is as strong as, after watching that Game Nights episode, is as strong as doubling ETB triggers. It's basically getting a whole nother spell for free, is what it's doing.
Crazy. And I highly recommend, if you haven't seen it already, go and watch that video, because I think it'll really contextualize what we're talking about here. But I agree with you. I think it is a Stax piece. I think you have to say so. And I think definitely Sheldon's justifications on that were pretty reasonable as well.
We're not saying that, yes, it should be banned, no, it shouldn't. We're very happy to leave that to the experts at the Rules Committee.
Totally.
We actually, both Walt and I think, but really do trust the Rules Committee in making the right decisions.
Absolutely, we do, yeah.
But big shout out to the Game Nights guys for representing that game in a really, really good environment and really positive attitudes towards the effects and all that kind of stuff. I actually really enjoyed it.
Yeah, totally agree. Let's continue with our game show, James, before we get too sidetracked. So, is it Stax, another Phyrexian Praetor, not a new one? Vorinclex Voice of Hunger. So this is the old Vorinclex cards. This is the green Praetor, 6 green, I believe. Yeah, that sounds right. It is, again, a Phyrexian Praetor, legendary creature. It says, if you would tap a non-land permanent for mana, it produces twice that much instead, I believe, or it might be plus
lands
1.
Specifically.
Might be just lands.
I think it's lands.
And then the second line of text, like with Elish Norn, it does the opposite sort of thing. It says, if a permanent would become tapped that an opponent controls, it's not the exact wording.
I actually think it's just lands. I think it's if an opponent would tap a land for mana, or even if they just tap a land, it doesn't untap in their next untap phase.
Yes.
And that answers your question, is it Stax? Yes, it does. It says it doesn't do this. Like straight up at the start of the episode, you said, look out for words that say can't, doesn't. This says it doesn't untap.
Yep. No, I totally agree with you. It
is Stax.
It's maybe a slightly more fair Stax piece, given it costs 8, but it's still Stax, I would say. Definitely.
But it's also a creature, can be cheated out, still a Stax piece.
Yep. No, I agree with you. All right. Next one's one we've talked about before. We're in the realm of white. Again, enchantments for 1 and a white, rest in peace.
I'm proud of you for getting through that without crying.
Just this one time, James. I had to build myself up for it. That's why I was talking so slowly.
Well, purely for the fact that it has stopped you from playing your Arami deck before. I'm going to say, it is a Stax piece.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, it's for 1 and a white, it's an enchantment that says, when it enters the battlefield, exile all graveyards. If anything would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead.
Yeah.
Importantly, this replaces the death trigger that would normally happen. So if something would trigger when it dies, it doesn't happen at all because it's exiled instead. Literally nothing can hit the bin while this is on the battlefield because it's a replacement effect. It's not going into the graveyard and then being moved into exile. It's a replacement. It's instead going straight from the battlefield into the exile zone. It never hits the bin, never triggers your dies triggers. I'm with you. I think it's a Stax piece.
I also think it fits in that category of silver bullet that we referred to earlier. It can really hose. It affects everyone, and most decks will interact with their graveyard in some way, whether it's a Spellslinger deck that's flashing it back, or a Reanimator deck, or even just like a green deck that has some green recursion of creatures to the top of library or to hand. Like, it affects everyone, but for you, for playing Arami, your entire deck is in your graveyard. Yeah. Like, that's how you play your game. So it is a silver bullet to some people, for sure.
No, totally agree. Next one is interesting. So we talked about Smokestacks, which we agree is definitely a Stax piece. So this in your upkeep forces you to sacrifice a creature for every soot counter on it, I think. It's something like that.
And then you put a soot counter on it, and then that effect happens. Something
like that. I'm interested in what you think for Fleshbag Marauder or Merciless Executioner. Do you reckon those are Stax pieces?
Ooh, I play these cards.
Me too.
Well, yeah, because they force your opponent to do something that is stopping their game. It's, it's not removal per se. It's like you're making your opponent do something in the same way that Smokestacks does it. It forces you to sacrifice. Yeah, it's doing the exact same thing as Smokestacks, but like in the same way Vorinclex doesn't let you untap, this makes you, whether you like it or not, do the thing that it wants to do.
That's interesting. I reckon I'm a bit on the fence with this one, because I think I'm totally with you. It definitely is asking the player to do the same thing, but this is not a persistent effect. Usually, like, it might come back, and usually people will recur these creatures, but it's not sitting on the battlefield saying, you can't do this. I would draw a line between this and the card I used to play in my Mirren deck, Archfiend of Depravity, which says, at the beginning of each player's end step, if that player controls more than 3 creatures, they sacrifice until they have 3, or something like that. That, I think, is definitely a Stax piece.
The old Sheoldred. Yep.
Same thing.
Same thing at the beginning of upkeep. Yeah, your opponent sacrifice a creature, but at the beginning of your upkeep, you reanimate.
Basically, Smokestacks, right?
Yeah.
The card. Yeah.
Totally. Reverse Smokestacks for you. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. No, on the fence, but I think
it's kind of like, and especially decks that like are built around that. Like, if you're building a Marin deck around like Looping Plaguecrafter, and
you're going to get it back. It's going to keep hitting the field again and again. Yeah, definitely. The last one I wanted to ask you about, there's a few effects like this. Propaganda. So for 2 and a blue, this is an enchantment that says, each...
Creatures can't, or player can't attack you unless they pay 2 for each attacking creature.
That's
right?
the wording. Yeah. So basically, if someone has 10 creatures they want to attack you, they have to pay 20 mana to attack you with those 10 creatures.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Do you think that's a Stax piece?
I mean, yeah, based on the $4,000 solution, Thought of Amethyst makes things cost more.
Yeah.
This is making attacking cost more, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's my justification.
Yep. I think that's totally right.
Yeah. I feel like I'm genuinely being quizzed now.
The way I'm grilling you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, my semi-hot take here is that I think almost all of these cards are Stax pieces. I'm totally agreeing with you. But some of them are harder Stax pieces than other. We sort of identified it as we were talking about it, right? Some of these cards, immediately, you almost don't want to call them a Stax piece because it's like, it almost cheapens the word Stax to use that as a thing. So it's kind of, we end up in this tricky situation where it's like, all of these things probably fit the bill as being Stax pieces.
But not all of them are at the same weight. Like, for example, like, you know, if you play Propaganda against me and I'm playing a Spellslinger deck that doesn't care about attacking, you're not really stopping my game plan.
No.
So it's softer on me than it is another player. But if you're saying all spells cost more, find me a deck in Magic the Gathering that doesn't cast a spell.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And the second half of this episode is basically going to be trying to work out how to justify how bad the Stax is and how playable it might be in a casual game.
All right.
But before we get to that...
Well, you said second half, so
I did
I'm
say
assuming...
second half. We're halfway through.
Are we taking a bit of a...
Thrifty interlude.
I just like the way you say that. Thrifty
I can see
interlude.
you waiting for it.
I was like, I did that kind of like wide-eyed, open mouth. You say it. Well, you say it. Thrifty interlude.
Thrifty interlude. Well, for this card, James, so for those who don't know, every episode I feature a card, and normally I'll do a zany monologue, sometimes an ad, some kind of strange interpretation of the card itself. I actually would like to enlist you as my my sorcerer's apprentice.
Oh.
I'd like you to do a dialogue with me
Oh.
for this card. We have rehearsed it extensively in advance, of course. So if James makes a mistake, he will be shot.
Yes, I've been in rigorous acting classes with Walt. And all his drama teachers, his dad, everyone that's ever taught Walt has been teaching me over the past month. There's a lot riding on this.
Yeah. Our whole careers, really.
Yeah, 100%. Yep.
Let's read the card.
Just let my partner go and we'll...
So, do you want to read the card we're doing this week?
Sure, it'd be my pleasure. Today's Thrifty Interlude card is Pramicon, Sky Rampart. For blue, red, and a white, you get a 1/5 legendary creature wall with flying and defender. As Pramicon Sky Rampart enters the battlefield, choose left or right. Each player may only attack the nearest opponent in the chosen direction, and planeswalkers controlled by that opponent.
Could you just look that way, please?
Oh, is this my better side?
Oh, yes. Much better. Yeah.
What's that rustling sound?
Just keep looking that way, please.
What are you up to?
Almost done.
Well, that doesn't answer my question at all.
Say cheese!
Is that a gun?
Get budgeted, 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 budgeted.
I featured in one.
You featured in one.
Yeah,
You're
that was
thrifty.
Cool. Did I die?
It's not clear.
To be answered when Pramicon gets reprinted.
At a later date. Yeah, exactly right. Well, if you want to see these bizarre text posts as I write them, they're released every Thursday on our Discord, which is linked in the show notes. And you can also see some of these performed as videos on TikTok at G_Commander Community. So chuck us a follow on there to see them as they come out.
Yeah, and as I've already mentioned this episode, if you really do want to get in touch with Walt and I, the Discord is the best place to do it.
Yeah.
Come and chat with us. Invite us to where you play. Obviously, we're based in Melbourne, Australia. Don't invite us to, LA.
Anywhere besides Melbourne, Australia, really.
We'll struggle to get there, but we're happy to make the drive.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And we'll definitely do our best with online stuff as well. So
Yeah.
if you have webcam games or something, we'll see how we go.
We'll get there.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the Stax, shall we?
Back to the Stax.
So we sort of established that we thought most of these effects that say can't, don't, won't do this are Stax pieces. So how on earth are we going to work out how bad they are, how hard they are, whether they're soft stacks, hard stacks, that kind of thing. I reckon I have sort of thought in the break, I did a bit of thinking. I reckon there's two main questions you can ask. And if you answer these correctly, I reckon you can work out just how strong or hard the stacks piece is. So the two questions that I have is, how crucial is the thing that the stacks piece is preventing? And can it be played around?
Oh, yeah, that's a pretty reasonable thing to, like, determine if you can play around it. It's not as brutal.
Yeah. And we sort of alluded to it already that, like, some of these things that we're saying can't and won't via our permanents that are stacks pieces are things that we don't need to do. You alluded to this with Vorinclex, right? Like, we don't need the +1 counters always all the time, but we do need to untap.
Or with Ghostly Prison, we don't need to attack all the time.
Yeah, we can wait.
We can do something. And even with, like, the cards that say you must do something, when we had that, like, Fleshbag Marauder kind of discussion, that's, like, you know, not as soft. It's not as hard because it's basically just the same as saying I remove that creature.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, basically. So let's jump straight into some examples, I reckon, because I reckon we can work out pretty much a bit of a spectrum of hard versus soft stacks.
Which end do you want to start on?
Let's start on the worst side.
Okay, so we end up at the nice bit.
Yeah.
I like that, okay.
So these are the cards. So again, we think all of these things we're outlining are likely to be stacks pieces, but we reckon that this is the hard end of the spectrum. So this is the stuff that if you're in casual, we would strongly recommend you don't play this. As we get towards the bottom of the list, we'll let you know when we get there. They're cards that you can play. I mean, you can always, obviously, all these cards are legal, but we recommend for casual games, you stick towards the bottom of the list. So let's start with, in my opinion, the thing that can't be played around at all, untapping permanents.
Yeah, yikes.
So examples here, Stasis is the classic Stax card. Winter Orb is the same. We talked about the older printing of Vorinclex, the 8 mana thing. All of these cards say, in some fashion, you can't untap your lands, you can't untap your artifacts, whatever.
Yeah.
How crucial is it being able to untap?
Incredibly. It's literally like untap, upkeep, draw. It's so crucial that Richard Garfield put it right at the start of your turn. Like, right at the beginning, because that is how you play your turn.
There should be no thoughts that are had before the untap step.
Yep.
You can't even interrupt someone's untap step, and this is probably why, because it's not something that should be interacted with, it should just happen.
Far out. Yeah, when you, like, really boil it down, you need to untap.
It's very, very difficult. In terms of playing around it, like, if you built a CDH Stax deck that could somehow do things with 1 mana, you know, like almost no mana at all, maybe you could play around it. In casual games, this is like almost impossible to play around these Stax pieces.
I'll tell you how you play around Winter Orb. You play Winter Orb in your Urza High Lord Artificer deck. And you just tap it on your opponent's end step so you can untap everything. That's disgusting. A weird old rule of Magic. Trust me, it works. That's how it works.
It's very, very strange.
Yep.
What do you reckon is like next on our spectrum of like, if we're still in the hard end of the spectrum, what's the next, like, still hard, but less so?
On the same theme of like accessing your mana base, I think using your lands, things that stop you doing that. So like, I'm thinking the one that comes to mind for me real quick is Blood Moon, because that is like, I remember that was like one of the first things that got introduced to me as a Stax piece way back in the day, and thankfully I was still playing like basics. So like,
this one definitely scales like that. The more expensive your mana base is. Yeah.
For reference, Blood Moon is non-basic lands are mountains.
Yeah.
Not tap for red. They are basic mountains. They are nothing else. That activated ability you had, gone. The fact that it's a 2-color land, gone. It now only taps for red. The only type it's got is mountain. And when I was introduced to this, I was playing a bunch of basics. So yeah, I still had basic islands and basic forests, whatever. But I remember I got hit with this when I played my Atraxa 4-color deck.
Yeah.
And I think I have about 7 to 10 basics in that deck.
And we recommend playing about 35 lands. So that's like less than half of your lands are basic.
For sure. And do you know what Atraxa doesn't have in her color identity?
Red.
Yeah. So Blood Moon, I very quickly learned, sucks against Atraxa players.
In the same vein, Magus of the Moon, same thing.
Yep.
It's just going to hose those multicolored mana bases.
Back to Basics is
Back to Basics.
another...
Totally an example. Infernal Darkness. There's a similar card called Contamination. These make all lands just produce black instead of whatever they would normally produce. Really, really miserable to play against. How crucial is it? We've just alluded to it. You need your mana, right?
Yeah.
You can't play without your mana. You absolutely must have it.
The premise of this game is that it's a resource management game,
Yeah.
and your main resource is your mana.
Yeah, your mana and your cards are the two things you need, right?
Yeah, if you can't access it, it's really hard to play the game.
Totally. In terms of playing around it, again, in specific circumstances, you may be able to. If you're playing a monocolored deck, you might have almost only basics. That might be fine. But this is also going to hit the board really disproportionately, where some players will be fine and others will really not. And that's going to feel bad. Similar to when we talked about Rest in Peace, that's going to make one person feel really bad for sure.
Yeah, I think your only play around is the ways you'd build your deck, and that ends up being an arms race, and we don't want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think next on the spectrum, so we're moving still further towards soft, but still on the hard end, is casting spells for their usual cost. So this, I would put basically every tax effect in this camp. So Sphere of Resistance, Aura of Silence, Dovin Hand of Control even, Trinosphere. Like all of these either make your spells cost more, or in the case of Trinosphere, does the strange thing of making everything cost 3.
At least 3. It can't be anything less than 3.
It's such a strange...
Which, if you're playing fast mana as well, sucks big somethings.
It's not ideal. And interacts really weirdly with other tax effects, actually. We won't go into that because those rules are really strange. But these, again, they can... I would say they're more able to be played around. Like, if you have a high curve, or you're not playing fast mana, you're not playing 1-drops, like, you could play around a Trinosphere. You could play reasonably well around an Aura of Silence, maybe.
See, this is the kind of Stax effects that I typically run in my, Liesa Shroud of Dusk deck.
Yeah.
I run the Talias that make, non-creatures spells cost 1 more.
Guardian of Thraben.
Yeah, and I play a couple of these effects, and I think that I differentiate it when I was having Rule Zero conversations. My Liesa deck has gotten a lot more Staxy, but way back when, it was much more of a life gain, life drain effect.
Yep.
I used to call it a death and taxes deck, and I think I used to stress the fact that it was a tax, not a Stax.
Yeah.
Which I think every playgroup's different with their terminology, but for me, a tax is like, a tax. The government takes a little bit of that payment. Takes it in. You just pretend to be the government for that game, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think Stax is a little bit different, and we've defined it pretty well. But tax, that's how I would define tax.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I think in this case, casting spells at the usual cost, I reckon it's still pretty crucial. It's not as crucial as the ones we've just outlined. I think we agree on that. And yeah, it can be played around, but it's pretty difficult, right?
Well, every deck has a mana curve for a reason, because that's the turn in which they wish to play certain spells, or their deck is planning on playing certain spells. So you playing these kind of taxing effects slows everybody down.
Yeah.
So, but it's not like, you're just slowing them down. You're not stopping them.
Yes.
Whereas not untapping my lands is stopping me.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, we've almost already reached a threshold here for these Stax pieces versus the ones above.
Do you think this is where, we can start encouraging people to, maybe have a think about this in Casual Commander?
I reckon around here is the spot where I would start doing it. I think it really depends on the specific piece. Trinosphere, I would highly encourage you not to play in Casual. It's pretty miserable. You don't really realize till you sit on the board.
Especially if you're playing against, there are quite a lot of decks that have a very low mana curve, and that's the point of their deck. And
But Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, it's not ideal, but also, creatures are a crucial part of any Magic the Gathering deck. So in most instances, someone might be able to play around it by just choosing not to cast their non-creature spells. Yeah, I reckon around here is where I would start to play.
The play around would be prioritizing what you want to cast.
Yeah.
Really choosing, what you want to cast.
Totally. The next one I would put here, I reckon. This is I reckon we're around the middle, still on the high end of the curve. I would put having cards in your hand as the next thing here. So these are Stax pieces that in some way prevent you from having cards in your hand. So cards like Necrogoyf, cards like Necrogen Mist, Oppression, all of these basically are permanents that sit on the battlefield and in some fashion make you discard cards from your hand, often every upkeep, or in the case of Oppression, whenever you cast a spell. God, miserable.
It's called Oppression for a reason.
Yeah, maybe this is the origin of calling things oppressive in Magic the Gathering.
Possibly.
This is definitely fairly crucial. I think we can agree, right?
Yeah, and to answer the secondary question of how, can you play around it? It is really hard to play around. The thing that makes it really hard to play around is usually the way to get out of these Stax effects are by answering them. And to answer them, you need to have the card in hand or to cast it. But if you're discarding your hand, you might not even end up drawing the card draw spell to refill your hand, to find the answer, destroy the thing.
Totally.
It's this kind of vicious cycle. The longer it sticks around,
the less likely you are to get out of it.
And the worse it will become. Yeah.
Totally. No, I definitely agree with that. And I think the only exception is if you're playing a very graveyard-oriented deck that can literally function without your hand at all. You may be able to find a way to play around it, but that's going to be rare. Like, most people are going to be like, okay, untap, upkeep, draw, discard, nothing else to do, pass turn. Like, it's not going to be fun for most people. Yeah.
All right, well, I think there's one card that I've mentioned before, and we've talked about it on this podcast a bunch of times, and I think it sits here, and it's Draneth Magistrate. And this card affects you accessing your commander, and I think that is the next level down the stack of stacks. Yeah,
I think this is around the middle, but that's not to say that it's fine now. We're not quite at that end of the curve yet. Draneth Magistrate is pretty miserable. Like, there's a reason we build commander decks. There's a reason that there are calls to ban Draneth Magistrate.
Yep.
We like our commanders. We like having access to them. We like being able to cast them multiple times in a game.
It's the whole point of our format.
It's a big chunk of it.
Yep.
I think it's, not ideal to not be able to have access to that. Another one I would throw in this camp is Arena of the Ancients. I only just saw this for the first time the other day. It's an artifact that when it enters the battlefield, tap all legendary permanents. Legendary permanents don't untap during their control's untap steps.
Oh, interesting. So if you have a commander that might not necessarily need to tap or attack, you can just stop everyone that has a commander with a tap-activated ability or a Voltron attacking commander.
Yeah, just anything that requires a turning it sideways is not going to work. But if you're playing a Muldrotha deck, whatever, your Muldrotha can be perfectly serviceable tapped. But, having played against this was pretty annoying. Admittedly, I was playing Kaza.
Oh, yours has a tap ability.
Yeah, literally has a tap ability. That was not very fun to play against. It's pretty crucial to have your commander. It's not essential, but for most of our decks, we're at least going to really want to have our commander there.
I think, and especially, I've given this advice to a lot of players that have asked for my advice on deck building before, that your deck should be able to do something without your commander.
It should.
Unless it is a, Niv Mizzet, CDH, Perun, Curiosity control list, and it wins via the command zone combo.
Yeah.
Your deck should do stuff without the commander.
It should.
A Merrin deck should be able to bring some creatures back from the bin anyway, without Merrin's ability.
Have some into the battlefield effects and some Dyer's effects.
Kaza should be able to cast some spells and interact with the board.
Yeah.
And, all these decks should be able to do something without your commander. But I think for commander players, this Stax effect is pretty brutal because we want to do it.
Yeah. So it can be played around, but it's not going to feel good to play around it, I think is what you're saying. Yeah, I totally agree.
All right, well, what's the next level down then?
I reckon we're now in the other end of the spectrum here. I reckon having creatures is what I would call this area. We sort of already alluded to this, but smokestacks sort of prevents you from having a certain number of creatures by making you sacrifice. Archfiend of Depravity we outlined before. I also would be interested to hear your thoughts on a few of these other cards that I sort of think of as in a similar fashion. Grave Pact effects, like Dictate of Erebos, Grave Pact, Butcher of Malakir. These effects that say whenever a creature I control dies, if I control the permanent, if I control Grave Pact, each opponent sacrifices a creature. These are pretty tough to play against.
Especially if you are playing an aristocrat strategy, or you are playing against the aristocrat strategy that is running this card.
Yeah.
We just did a deck tech episode on aristocrats.
We did, yeah.
And I think we touched on Butcher of Malakir. I don't think we dove too deep into it.
No.
Because I don't think we wanted to suggest that all aristocrats decks should include these.
No.
Because these effects in an aristocrat strategy where you are sacrificing things over and over again basically just mean your opponents have nothing.
Yeah. And look, like, there's something to be said for, you know, like an Archfiend of Depravity. Like, each opponent can't have more than 3 creatures. There's something to be said for, like, the way that reins in some of the things we don't like to see in the format, but it is going to be very difficult to play around, and some people are going to find that really tough to get their head around.
Yeah.
And I agree, Gravepact, Dictator of Erebos, these kinds of effects, similar sort of thing. Like, on the wrong board state, when there's a free sack outlet there, you're kind of like, well, I could play creatures, but they're literally just going to die if I do so. What do? I can't really see a way out of this. You might not even be in colors to remove enchantments if you're trying to deal with a Grave Pact or Dictator of Erebos.
And, like, we've already discussed, like, effects like, you know, Fleshbag Marauder, where a card says your opponents must do this thing. And even though that thing that they're doing, you want to do, possibly, if you're in Aristocrats, you want to sacrifice stuff, they don't want to. So by forcing them to do the thing, it's slowing their game plan, it's stopping them from playing the game.
Definitely. So in terms of, like, crucial, I think it's, like, it varies a lot. It's usually pretty crucial to have some number of creatures, but not always. And playing around it is going to be doable. It's not impossible. It's not necessarily easy. It can be in certain strategies, but it's definitely possible.
And yeah, for sure, especially when you take into consideration, like, you know, okay, now that at the end of my turn I have to sacrifice 3 creatures, I need to find a way of giving things haste so I can get the most amount of value out of them before they go to the graveyard. Or, you know, it forces you to think a little bit differently about how you play your deck. So it doesn't stop you from playing the game, but it definitely slows you down.
Yeah, it redirects you a little bit, definitely. What else would you put around this sort of middle of the pack spot?
Well, I mean, okay, so every deck I think has creatures at some point, but then you get to a level where there are, like, particular mechanics that your deck wants to access, and there are definitely certain cards. I think these could be considered silver bullets, but these are the cards that really stop a particular card from happening. So, like, the new Elish Norn, the new Vorinclex that we just mentioned. There are a bunch of these. Like, you know, the one that there's an old stops ETB from entering. Happening.
Hushwing Griff.
Hushwing Griff, yeah.
Linvala, Keeper of Silence is a similar kind of thing. This stops, I think, activated abilities. Malira, Silvok Outcast stops Infect specifically.
Or counters being put on players.
Yes, it does too. Yeah,
so, like Solemnity, players can't get counters. That stops experience counters.
It does. So it's strange, right? It's kind of difficult to get our heads around how crucial these are, because it really depends on the deck, right? Like, if you're playing a Flicker deck and someone's got a Hushwing Griff on the board, that is pretty crucial to you. It's not essential, but it's pretty important to your strategy, and it's going to be hard to play around. But if you don't have any ETBs at all, like if you're just playing a Spellslinger deck, that might not matter to you at all. So it's like, I think it's hard to gauge exactly how crucial these are. I think I would use the term silver bullet cards here, which is to say that they are going to hose particular strategies and leave others alone. And it's just a bit of a weird kind of spot we end up in as a game when this is what's happening.
But there are some cards that are, like, worse than others in this case. Like, we just talked about the fact that the new Elish Norn just is a worse, I'm going to stop this mechanic, because it's surprising how many decks use that mechanic and how much they use it.
Well, in a funny sort of a way, I almost wonder if this whole category can kind of move along the spectrum depending on what mechanic is being turned off.
Possibly.
So, yeah, like, I think turning ETBs off is pretty bad. Like, it's pretty tough to play around that.
I think it's been surprising everyone how many decks... Because, like, you built an ETB Flicker deck, but, like, I've looked at my decks and, I have a lot of things that say, when this enters the battlefield, do this.
Yeah, have a flick through some of your commander lists. You'll be shocked at how many of your cards have some kind of enter the battlefield effect.
But +1 counters, for example?
Yeah, like we talked about with the new Vorinclex.
Yeah,
like,
you have to be building around.
You can play around that as well. Yeah, totally you can. So I think you can play around it, and I think it's reasonably crucial, but it depends on what's actually happening. And I do think there is something to be said, though, before we move on from this, for the fact that, some players will actually almost feel more upset by the fact that this only affects them. Like, you know, if I'm playing my Arami deck and someone resolves a Rest in Peace, it actually feels worse that I'm the only player who doesn't get to play the game. Because I can see the game unfolding around me. I'm still an active participant in it, but I feel like a spectator in a game that I'm actually a part of.
And this is what results in those arms races that we were talking about before. Because, like, then you start including things that search player's library for a card and you remove it from the game.
Yeah.
Like, it's a really interesting area. But you mentioned Rest in Peace. And I genuinely think that might be the next level, which is interacting with your graveyards.
Yeah.
And Stax effects that stop it. I think there's a bit of I'm going to call it a spectrum. You called it a spectrum earlier.
Yeah.
There's an inter-spectrum thing here, and I think at the very top end are cards like Douthie Void Walker or Rest in Peace.
Right. So
those effects that just say, no, graveyards don't exist.
Yeah, they go straight into exile.
Absolutely don't exist.
Dice triggers don't even happen. Yeah, I agree with you. And then there's sort of like a middle tier of stuff that kind of stops you using the graveyard, but is not so oppressive. Like, it's not exiling it, like Kunoros.
Oh, the Hound. I play that in my Liesa deck.
Yeah, I play it in my my Sisei sort of slightly stacksy deck. Ashes of the Abhorrent is kind of been called the fair rest in peace before. This is the one that says whenever a creature dies, you gain a life. And creatures in it's something like creatures in graveyards
can't enter the battlefield from a graveyard.
Yeah, and like creatures in graveyards can't be the target of spells or abilities or something. Like
so you can't return it to hand.
No, but it's not exiling it. It's not saying to the graveyard player, "Hey, all your toys are gone and broken."
I smashed them with a hammer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
I think this is very similar to the last category where, how crucial it is does vary depending on the deck that you're playing. And whether it can be played around also varies a lot. And again, this can result in some players feeling really salty and others feeling fine. And that can actually make that salty player feel more salty.
For sure.
I reckon, what do you reckon's next sort of in this sort of zone of, we're sort of moving towards fine, but still not quite out of tricky zone.
All right. Well, if we're not quite out of like this is totally fine at any table kind of thing, I think something that affects all players, unless you're playing a one big spell a turn deck, is casting multiple spells on your turn.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cards out there like Rule of Law, Eidolon of Rhetoric, Deafening Silence, Archon of Emeria. Like, that's off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But like, there are a lot of cards that basically say each player can only cast one spell a turn. Yeah,
in the case of Deafening Silence, it's one non-creature spell, but otherwise, it's literally just constraining your spell count down to one. These do vary a lot depending on like what kind of a deck you are playing. Obviously, if you're playing Spellslinger, you're going to be pretty upset to see this.
Storm, you're gonna be upset.
Also going to feel pretty bad. How crucial it is. I actually think this is slightly higher than some of the ones we might have talked about, which is to say that I think most decks actually they don't need to, but they want to cast multiple spells in a turn. Like, if given the option, we almost always would.
Yeah, exactly. And like, this is the thing of like, the value you'll get out of casting 3 3-drops compared to 1 6-drop.
Yeah.
On your turn, or 1 6-drop and 1 3-drop, like however much money you have, like however the combo lines up, it's what is going to be the most amount of value on your board, how are they synergizing with each other.
Yeah.
So they're all going to come into that when you'd make that decision of what you cast on your turn. But when someone just says, all right, Rule of Law, everyone can only get 1 spell a turn, then you're like, okay, what single card in my hand is the one that I want this turn?
Yeah.
And like, that's the play around, isn't it? Is prioritizing what spell you're going to cast that turn.
Yeah, and these can be played around reasonably successfully. Yep. So I think, there will definitely be people who will sit down with cards like these and feel a bit salty about it. Certainly if they weren't warned before the game that there was some of these pieces in there. But it can be played around by almost everyone, so I think usually you're okay seeing these, at least.
I usually am too. I think the other reason why I'm okay seeing this is because, as you know, I'm a player that loves to do stuff on other people's turn. These effects are great for those players because you can actually get a lot of value out of this kind of situation. If you're playing a lot of flash and instant speed stuff, you can actually do stuff on everyone else's turn, meaning you're doing more than one thing a rotation, whereas everyone else is only doing one thing a rotation.
That's true. I didn't think of that, but that's totally a way that you can play around it. And there's a good chunk of decks that want to do that, definitely. I reckon, so we're moving very much towards the low end of the curve now. The next one I would mention is using artifacts.
Oh, like Collector Roof.
Yeah, Collector Roof's a good example. Yasharn.
Oh, your CDH commander.
Yep. Actually stops you being able to sacrifice it on land permanents.
Dockside Extortionist becomes terrible.
Yeah. These... how crucial is it to be able to use artifacts varies quite a lot. I have decks that don't use any artifacts at all.
Yep.
I will say there's a rare. I also have decks where, I have 40 to 50 artifacts in them because they're an artifact deck. So, it depends on the Stax piece and it depends on how many artifacts I'm playing. But usually you can play around this, right?
Usually you can play around this, but I think like the impact on a table that one of these cards will have is going to hit a lot of players purely because artifacts are one of the strongest archetypes in Magic the Gathering. A lot of them are colorless. They go in a lot of decks. I think, just purely overseeing how all formats, not just Commander, have embraced artifacts and especially treasures in recent years. Oh my lord. I think that slowing down or stopping artifacts affects the table pretty broadly, but again, you've still got your lands. You've still got, mana dorks.
Yeah.
There's almost things to do.
Something to be said. We'll sort of touch on this later, but there's almost something to be said for a little bit of maybe these kind of effects of sometimes, like, the sorts of treasure cards they've printed, you almost want to slow them down a little bit. It's so explosive that it's like,
like, I just mentioned Dockside. Oh my god, Dockside's bad.
Yeah, definitely.
When was the last time you've ever heard anyone say, oh no, Dockside's a terrible card?
Doesn't really happen, does it?
The Yashan player, that's when.
Yeah, that's exactly why. Your bloody Dockside sucks. Yeah.
Silly little goblin.
I think at the very, very lowest end of the curve, we've already talked about one of these cards. There's a sort of category I would call being able to attack or block.
Yeah.
So Propaganda's the one that comes to mind.
Ghostly Prison.
Yeah. Sphere of Safety works similarly.
That's a super strong one in your CSA deck.
Well, yeah, if you can pump out enchantments, that one's really good. There's similar sorts of cards like Pramicon, actually. Sky Rampart, I would say, sits in this thing because it'll stop some players from attacking some other players.
Yeah, I'd love to hear a performance of that card.
If only. But there's also like sort of blind obedience and authority, the console effects that make creatures enter tapped.
So basically get rid of haste in that situation.
Negates the effect of haste, negates the ability to block with those creatures this turn cycle. These, I think, are much less crucial to be able to attack or block. Like you will need it in certain instances, but you don't always need it all the time, kind of thing.
And I think that in every game, there is going to be someone that can eliminate a player without attacking them.
Yes.
So, like, at a table, okay, maybe your deck does swing. Maybe you're in a combat-based deck and someone drops a Propaganda. You're like, oh no, I can't eliminate them now.
Yeah.
But, Declan's over there being like, it's alright, I'm playing Burn. Watch his life code will go down.
Yeah.
If you're at a play group, that's when, here's your play around, politic your way out of this situation.
Yeah.
There you go, there's a way to play around it.
How can we eliminate this player outside of combat? Yeah, totally.
I think there's heaps of play arounds as well, and I think that also, like, unless your, deck's win con is eliminating via combat, think about how your deck wins and whether or not this is really impacting your game plan. A very common win con is going wide and swinging and using like overwhelming stampede, but can you turn that your go wide strategy into a Voltron strategy? Maybe you've got one of those creatures in your deck that says its power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control. Give that thing unblockable and punch their face, pay the 2 mana for Propaganda and get through. It makes you think differently about how your deck is going to win against that player.
Totally. I think the other thing that we should touch on there is the fact that in our deck building template, we talked about, even if you are playing a go wide deck, we recommend having like 3 to 4, maybe even 5 win con cards in there. And we recommend at least one of those is not inherently going to combat going wide. So whether it's pumping one thing, making it really huge. We've talked about cards that you can...
Goblin Bombardment's
fantastic. Chiron Negotiations works similarly.
Yep.
Like, you should have at least one way to get around a player like this, because this type of Stax, and we do still call it Stax, is very soft and you see it all the time, and you should have some plans for it, for sure.
It's comparing the, the Vorinclex Don't Untap Your Lands monster behemoth lion to a kitty cat Stax. Like, that's your comparison.
It's really night and day, but they are all kind of still Stax pieces. Yeah.
100%.
Well, look, that's all feels a little bit doom and gloom, right? To kind of go like, all of these are Stax pieces, and like
the world is out to stop me.
Yeah, and people don't like Stax. What am I going to do? But we sort of alluded to it already, that there is something to be gained from playing a little bit of Stax. there are things that we often don't like to see in Commander games, like how we don't like to see stacks, that actually are controlled a bit by stacks pieces.
Yep.
We don't like to see excessive ramp from lands. A lot of people don't like landfall decks. They don't like decks that get a million mana by turn 5. Confounding Conundrum.
Oh, that's the one from Zendikar Rising, right? Wherever a land enters the battlefield if it wasn't played, it bounces to hand.
Yeah.
Hilarious.
So they still get their landfall triggers, but they're not getting like 8-9 mana by turn 5 kind of thing. Combos typically require a lot of spells being cast, or particular spells being cast in particular orders, often on the same turn. Rule of law effects that only let you cast one spell a turn make combos much more difficult to get off. They make them much easier to see coming, much easier to plan for.
Even at, like, you know, when we talk about, like in our deck building templates, we said like tutors are something that make your deck higher powered immediately when you put it in.
Yeah.
Cards like Opposition Agent and Ashiok just go, you know what, that mechanic now doesn't exist, and actually you're going to benefit from it. Well done for playing me.
Even like Avid Mindsense is a similar kind of thing. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And we said that we sort of generally don't love seeing lots of tutors in our games, so that is a way of controlling how often we see them.
Yeah.
In a similar vein, we talked about Treasure, we talked about Dockside Extortionist, Collector Roof, Yashan, even recent cards like Sardian Avenger. It's an interesting one, actually. I think I've told you about this. It's a goblin for 1 and a red. When it attacks, it's got a first strike and trample. When it attacks, it gets +X+O for each artifact
that's a funny
on the
card.
battlefield, I think, or something crazy. And whenever a player sacrifices an artifact, it deals 1 damage to them. So
I have
Treasures
seen this card. It's
ping you
sick.
for 1. It's a really good... It's a very recent printing. It was in Brothers War.
It's also red, right? It's
red. Yeah, one and a red.
The fact that it's red is like red saying to what red does best. Nah.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of funny.
It is funny. But it's sort of... I think it's clear now that there is actually an interest from Wizards of the Coast in printing cards that control some of the crazy things that are legal in Commander now. So I actually have a bit of a question for you.
Sure.
Do you think the next shift in cards that we'll see in our format, because we've seen so many busted cards like our Dockside Extortionists, you know, fast, accelerating kind of cards be printed recently. Do you think the next shift in Commander's sort of format and philosophy will be towards cards that limit the strength of those cards, like soft stacks pieces and like the recent Elish Norn?
Interesting question. And I think it's an interesting question because I think Commander inherently is controlled, well, by the Rules Committee, but also the Rules Committee is a representation of the players. But the cards are printed by Wizards of the Coast. So the question is, do you think Wizards of the Coast is trying to steer Commander back away from the mistake they clearly made with these Dockside Extortionist-like cards, and now trying to go, okay, now we're trying to correct this? My question is a bit of a... I'm going to hit it back to you.
Okay.
Is, do you think it'll be an overcorrection?
Oh.
Do you think Wizards are going to end up in a bit of a to and fro? Oh, we print Dockside Extortionist. Okay, we'll print Elish Norn so Dockside Extortionist doesn't work. Oh, Elish Norn's busted. Okay, we'll print a card that says destroy all Elish Norns. Like, you know, do you think that it's going to just become an arms race, but by Wizards of the Coast themselves printing these cards?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I mean, my internal optimist says, God, I really hope not.
Yeah.
Because I think that's not a good format that fluctuates back and forth across different strategies.
Also, Commander's meant to be evergreen. We're meant to be able to build a deck and have that deck for years, and it's still...
doesn't feel completely like that these days with how busted some cards are. I hope we end up at a spot where there are just more options. More options for approaching how we want to respond to our opponents, how we want to prevent our opponents, how we want to accelerate ourselves, and that none of these cards become ubiquitous. I think that's the real problem, is when players feel as though there are cards they must play and strategies they have to plan for. I don't think that's good for the format. And I think Stax actually is a way that we can explore a new way of playing. So look, given that it's all stacks, we've established it's all stacks, if we do decide that we want to play it, how do we know which ones to play and whether we should play it at all? I think it's worth considering definitely the spectrum we outlined. Yeah. That's definitely a big one.
I think we did a pretty decent... You did, very good job there, Walt, on giving us a spectrum of stacks.
Thank you.
Hard to soft, the lion to kitty cat. I'm going to take that into Commander decks in the future.
I hope so. But I think as well, if we're going to be trying to up the power level of our deck, we can move up that spectrum too, right?
For sure.
Like we said, CDH, all these cards are totally expected and planned for.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you really are just trying to get your deck, especially if you feel the strategy is not quite cutting it, maybe Stax is the thing that makes it that next bit more powerful, so you can play it against the people you play against in your play group who play combo decks and who play, infinite, turns and all these crazy things.
Yeah.
Maybe Stax is what gets your deck there, so you feel like you're competitive on that table.
Stranglehold stops those extra turns, so maybe it's like your way through it.
Yeah.
And I know that, like, I'm interested to know your opinion, because we've referenced your Sisay Shrines deck quite a bit at this table and in this podcast. And I have my Liesa Shroud of Dust deck, which, to be honest, has recently received these upgrades into harder Stax pieces, the bigger lions, I guess.
Yeah.
You've had your Sisay deck for a while, but to be honest, I don't see you pilot it that much.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like to be really honest with people when I pull it out. So I think I've said this before on the podcast. I will pull out every card in the deck that I think some people, some people may have some issue with, and that includes all of it. That includes my Sphere of Safety propaganda style effects. It includes my Deafening Silence. It includes my Kanoros. But even Pramicon. Sometimes I pull it out and just be like, hey, just so you know, if you're playing combat, it might be tricky. And look, a good chunk of the time I can see just from someone's expression on their face that it's not the game that they're after, and that's fine. But when I do get to pilot it, it's a blast. So I hope the thing that you take away from this episode is, yes, Stax is everywhere, and a good chunk of it's unpopular, and it's going to be hard to find the right pod for it. But when you do find the right pod for it, it's going to be really fun, and some people are actually going to love the challenge that Stax provides, and are going to enjoy the fact that you've introduced these new cogs that they have to sort of sort through and work out how they're going to get to their win and get to their fun game of Commander.
For sure. I played against Sisay just recently and I had a good time.
Oh, there you go.
Well, Space Commanders.
Command received.
You saluted. Thank you for joining me that time.
I did it one finger. I'm working my way back.
And it wasn't even at the head either. It was like above your shoulder. You're like, Command received.
I'm suave. I'm cool.
I'm too cool to salute you.
Well, to all of you out there, do you feel commanded? What do you think of Stax? Are there any Stax pieces you're thinking about trying out now that we've talked about them? And don't forget, the best place to get in touch with us, we have a few contacts and stuff in our show notes, but our Discord is the best place to chat with us about Stax, about anything you like, really, your decks, your play group, anything you feel like.
Yeah.
Definitely join the Discord, and that's the best way to chat about Stax and all that stuff.
And really exciting, all of my decks are now in Moxfield, updated, ready to go. So if you've been looking at Walt's decks and criticizing him on Discord, you're now more than welcome to look at my decks and tell me why I'm a terrible deck builder.
In the show notes.
Yeah, I was actually really pleasantly surprised with some of the response that I got from our Discord community when I posted it. Some people were like, oh, I know you don't play Orzhov that much, but I can really help you out with your card draw. You've only got 5 tagged pieces of card draw. What happened to 10 minimum? I'm like, great question. Help me out, please. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to
leveling up.
Yeah. And
how exciting.
Also, before we planeswalk outside the world of Magic, and in this case, out of our chains that are Stax, I'm gonna give a bit of shameless self-promotion. I know we ask people to like subscribe to the podcast and do all that, but I'm gonna ask our listeners to do something a little bit extra for us in the next couple of episodes. If you guys like the content we're producing and want to hear more from us, we've got some great people saying that it's great to hear Australian content being made. We've had some really lovely comments about how inclusive our language is, and all this kind of stuff. If you want to support our content and want to see more content from us, maybe want to see us on video, or maybe want to see us doing some exciting things, one of the ways you can help without doing much at all is simply liking the podcast on all the social media platforms, and also leaving a review for us and rating our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcast. For some reason, Google Podcasts it doesn't have that feature.
No, very
randomly.
strange. Don't know why.
But if you listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, which we know most of you listen on anyway, please leave a review. Give us that 5-star rating. This really helps us be recommended to people via like recommendation engines online and stuff like that. So,
and our growth will definitely result in more exciting stuff that you can expect from us. So
sure.
like it's the best way to show that you really love what we do, and if you love what we do, we'll do more of it. So
and I'm
really
not gonna
appreciate
lie,
it.
I love what we do.
Yeah,
I enjoy this.
Absolutely.
This is great. I get to talk with my best bud about Magic, my favorite game every week. It's
and
great.
thank you so much for joining us every time that we do it. And yeah, if you it'll take 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes.
Not even.
Leave us a review. If you do listen on Google Podcasts and you can't leave us a review, just tell your friends about us.
Yeah, please.
Recommend us out there somewhere.
Share our link on all your Discord servers. Spam us everywhere. Actually, don't do that.
don't spam.
Tell that we exist to people that you think will like our stuff.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. Well, it is customary at the end of the episode, James, to planeswalk out of here, out of the world of Magic, into something else. What do you want to planeswalk to this week? It's your turn.
Well, we're going to planeswalk to a video game world, which is a place where books can talk, love is dying, and you have to work with a friend or partner to rebuild your marriage.
This sounds familiar.
Have you ever played It Takes Two?
No, but I've always wanted to.
Man, me and my partner Theo have played this game like pretty much every night for the past week. Surprising amount of content in this game.
I've heard really good things about it.
It has a lot of stuff in it, and there's so many things that, you know, it's not open world, it's like level based, like you go through a level, but the level is so expansive, and there's, you know, side tracks you can get distracted down, there's little Easter eggs, there's little mini games and all this kind of stuff.
Wow.
It is awesome, but the premise of the game is exactly what I just kind of alluded to. You're in a failing marriage, and your daughter wishes for you to become friends again. And she wishes over these two little dolls that she'd made of her parents, that were going to represent her parents.
Yeah.
And she cried into a book that was written by Dr. Hakim, made-up character. He's a love expert.
Sure.
Anyway, the tears of your daughter in your failing marriage transport your souls into the two little dolls.
Wow.
And you then become these two little dolls, and that's how you play the game. You play as these two little dolls.
Right.
And basically, you have to... It's like a teamwork game. It's like all other like co-op games that you've ever played, but this one is... Firstly, the animation is gorgeous. My character is like a clay dude.
Right.
And my partner's character, Theo, is like this like wooden doll thing. It's really cool. But each level, you get like different abilities. Like the very first level, you're in like the workshop shed where the daughter's built these little dolls. And you have to get out. So you have to use things like table saws to like whiz across and all this kind of stuff. You have to use hammers and nails to like open certain boxes.
I think I've seen this level before.
It's really fun.
It looks like a really detailed world, and like lots to do, lots to interact with, and like problem solving as well.
It is, and honestly, like the boss battles as well are like really well balanced. We've only lost, my partner and I played a lot of video games, but like we've only lost to the boss battles maybe like 2 or 3 times.
Right.
So they're challenging, and like we're on our edge of our seat. We're going, get it. But then they're achievable enough that you don't get like stuck or distracted or frustrated with one another.
Right.
It's like the perfectly balanced.
You have to work together.
Game.
It takes two.
It takes two. But yeah, so me and my partner Theo have been exploring some other multiplayer games to play. There's a great game by the same developers. There's actually an Easter egg in It Takes Two of this game. It's called A Way Out. And it was like their first game, and you play 2 prisoners escaping from prison.
I've seen this one. I've definitely seen that one played before. Yeah, that one looked like a lot of fun too.
We've just downloaded it on the Xbox, so we're really excited to play. But
I love doing multiplayer gaming. I play a lot with my partner as well. I've played a lot of the Lego games, like Lego Star Wars, and
I love Overcooked was one we played a lot in lockdown.
Yeah, that one's particularly good with like 4 people.
Yeah,
that one's
that gets
hectic and lots of fun. I also, we've been playing the new Lego Star Wars, which has been really, really fun.
Oh yeah, I played a bit of that. I should jump back into it because it's like a Lego game, but it's like the mechanics are remastered. It's like a third-person shooter almost.
It's a massive open world.
Yeah.
There are so many planets, and each planet is like a huge amount of content to engage with and like problems to solve. Like it's A lot.
And it's the whole saga, right? It's like all from episodes 1 through 9.
Skywalker Saga, 1 to 9. Yeah.
Really cool.
Really, really, really awesome.
Well, I have been loving multiplayer games, and I'm going to be playing a lot more of them. So that's my plans.
Love it. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll catch you all really soon.
See you in the next episode, guys.
Bye.
Bye.